Okay, let's unpack this human observation. We all do it all the time.
Right.
But the sources we've been looking at, this multifaceted analysis of human and AI observation, they reveal it's way more than just our eyes taking things in.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really fundamental and active way we make sense of the world, crucial not just for, survival, but for everything we've learned and built as a species.
And what's fascinating, as these sources really highlight, is just how deeply ingrained this is across all of history. In like every culture, observation has been the starting point. Think about ancient astronomers charting the stars, or even just a child learning to catch a ball. This core ability is the foundation of so much of our understanding.
Exactly. And that brings us to what we want to explore in this deep dive. We're focusing on human observation, but specifically through the lens of artificial intelligence.
Okay.
How are AI systems trying to understand what we see? How can AI help us see more clearly ourselves? And, how does the data AI learns from, which of course comes from us, shape its own capabilities?
It's a huge topic. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's clear we need to look at this from multiple angles.
Right.
As the source material emphasizes, ideas from cognitive science, biology, philosophy, even physics, they all play a role here. It's a truly interdisciplinary subject.
And one of the immediate insights, I think, is that observation isn't just passively recording reality like a camera.
No, at all.
It's an active construction. What we already believe, what's happening inside our minds, all of that actively shapes what we end up perceiving. It's not just straightforward input.
That's a key point. And it's really interesting how studying AI is actually giving us new ways to understand this active process in ourselves.
So how do we even begin to understand something so fundamental?
Well, our sources provide a pretty good structure, actually. We'll start with the basic ways observation works, from our senses up to our brains.
The mechanics.
Exactly. Then we'll look at how observation builds our knowledge and shapes culture. After that, we'll delve into how our own perspectives, our subjectivity, can shape what we see.
Biases and things like that.
Precisely. And then the role AI is playing now, and finally, some of the really crucial ethical considerations that come up.
All right, sounds like a plan. So let's get into how this all works on a fundamental level. It makes sense to start with how we even evolved to observe in the first place, right?
Absolutely. The sources point out that observation isn't just a human thing. It's been vital for the survival of almost all living things.
Finding food,
staying safe from predators, recognizing mates. It all depends on observing the environment. And our senses have evolved in these amazing ways, each tailored to different needs.
But our senses aren't perfect, are they? There are limits to what we can actually take in.
Exactly. The sources mention these evolutionary constraints. There are biological trade-offs involved.
Oh.
We can't perceive everything. Our observational abilities are shaped by what has historically given us an advantage for survival and reproduction.
Okay, so we've got the biological basis, the evolutionary drive. Now, how does all that raw sensory information become something we actually understand?
Right. That involves what cognitive scientists often call the cognitive pipeline.
Okay.
Our sources break it down into sensation and perception, attention, memory, and learning. Sensation is just the initial detection of stimuli by our sense organs.
Light hitting the eyes, sound waves.
Exactly. Raw data. But perception is the active part. Our brains organizing and interpreting that raw data to make it meaningful.
So that's the construction part you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. A key insight here is that what we experience isn't a direct feed from the world, but a highly constructed reality, shaped by our prior knowledge and expectations.
Right, so what we think we're seeing isn't just a photograph taken by our eyes. Our brain is already doing a lot of interpretation.
A lot.
And then comes attention, which I know can be a tricky thing. We can't pay attention to everything at once.
We definitely can't. Attention acts like a filter, or maybe a spotlight. There's just too much information bombarding us constantly.
Uh-huh.
So attention focuses our mental resources on what seems most important at that moment and screens out, or at least dampens, the rest.
But this also means we inevitably miss things, right?
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention the attentional blink. Have you heard of that?
I think so. Remind me.
It's where if you're really focused on detecting one thing, like a specific letter in a stream of letters, you can completely miss a second target that appears right after it.
Wow.
Even if it's right there. It just highlights a significant limitation of our attentional system. We have bottlenecks.
That's a bit mind-bending. Okay, so attention filters. And then memory gets involved, because what's the point of noticing something if you can't recall it later?
Exactly. Memory is crucial. We need to encode, store, and retrieve information from our observations to learn from experience and recognize patterns over time.
But memory isn't perfect either, is it? People misremember things all the time.
That's a really important point our sources make. Memory isn't like a perfect video recording. It's reconstructive.
Oh, reconstructive.
Meaning our memories can change each time we recall them. They can be influenced by later information, our current beliefs. They aren't always entirely accurate. They can be quite fallible.
Which leads directly to learning, doesn't it? Because a lot of how we learn is through watching others. Observation is key there.
Absolutely. Observation is a fundamental way we learn. Think about learning a new skill by watching an expert do it.
Yeah.
Our sources discuss Albert Bandura's social learning theory, or social cognitive theory, as it's also known. It shows how we learn effectively by observing others, what they do, and crucially, what happens to them as a result.
Okay.
This involves several steps. Paying attention to the model, remembering what they did, retention, being able to actually perform the action, initiation or reproduction, and having the motivation to do it.
And you mentioned consequences.
Yes, we also learn vicariously. By seeing others rewarded or punished for their actions, we learn what behaviors are likely to be beneficial or costly for us without having to try them ourselves.
That makes sense. Saves a lot of trial and error. So it's not just about what we see, but also the consequences of what we see.
Exactly.
Now, what about that internal urge to observe? What makes us even want to look in the first place? What drives that?
That's where curiosity comes in.
Uh-huh.
It's a really powerful driver.
Okay.
Our sources describe it as a basic drive, a fundamental desire for information. William James called it the impulse towards better cognition.
I like that. Impulse towards better cognition.
Yeah. And it shows up in different ways. There's perceptual curiosity, just wanting new sensory experiences, exploring. And then there's epistemic curiosity, really wanting to understand things, to fill knowledge gaps.
Okay.
And you can also think about specific curiosity when we're trying to find a particular piece of information to solve a problem versus diversive curiosity, which is more like a general openness to new things, maybe fighting boredom.
So there are different flavors of curiosity.
Right. And the key takeaway is this powerful cycle. The more curious you are, the more you observe, the more you learn.
It makes you more curious.
Exactly. Which in turn fuels even more curiosity. It is like a self-propelling engine for learning and growth. And curiosity seems to enhance memory for what we learn too.
It's like that mental itch that only new information can scratch. Now, the sources also touch on intuition. That feels a bit different from conscious, deliberate observation.
It is, yeah. Intuition is more that quick, unconscious assessment, that gut feeling we sometimes get.
So what is it, really?
Well, our sources explain it not as some mystical power, but as our brain rapidly recognizing patterns based on lots and lots of past observations and accumulated experiences, even if we don't consciously remember all those specific instances. It's like a mental shortcut, drawing on all that implicit learning we've done over time.
So it's not some magical insight, but actually built up from all our previous observations, even ones we aren't aware of?
Exactly that. It's a skill, really, developed over time through experience and our brain's amazing ability to spot patterns. The sources even mentioned that being aware of our internal bodily signals, interoception, might play a role too.
Interesting. And when we consider the limitations, we talked about attention, memory, perhaps they're not just flaws. You hinted at this.
Right, yeah. It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Right.
Limitations is actually helpful.
It does sound a bit weird.
But think about it. In a world overflowing with information, we need to prioritize. Limited attention helps us focus cognitive resources on what's most relevant for our goals right now.
Okay, I can see that. Filtering the noise.
And while memory isn't perfect, maybe retaining the gist, the most important or frequently encountered information, rather than every single sensory detail, is actually more efficient. It prevents us from being completely overwhelmed.
A trade-off for efficiency.
Perhaps. Plus, our sources point out that learning from others' observations, that social learning we discussed, allows us to gain crucial knowledge and skills without having to experience all the potential dangers or costs ourselves.
Right, learn from others' mistakes or successes.
Exactly. So our observational system seems to be adaptively designed for efficient interaction with the complex world, rather than being like a flawless, high-fidelity recording device.
That's a really interesting way to frame it. Not flaws, but features. Okay, so moving on from the individual mechanics, how does all this observing actually shape the world we live in, our knowledge, our culture?
Yeah, observation isn't just about individuals taking things in. It's the active way we collectively build knowledge and pass on our culture. It's fundamental in so many areas.
Let's start with science, because that seems like the most obvious place where observation is just crucial.
Absolutely. Our sources basically call observation the bedrock, the foundation of the scientific method.
Right.
It's where inquiry begins with questions sparked by noticing something interesting or puzzling in the world. This leads to forming hypotheses, gathering data through more systematic observation or experimentation, and then testing those ideas against further observations.
And scientists use tools, obviously, to see things we couldn't normally see, microscopes, telescopes.
Exactly. Instruments extend our natural senses, allowing us to observe phenomena at vastly different scales, from the subatomic to the cosmic.
And the sources give a great historical example here. Gregor Mendel and his pea plants.
Yes. That's such a classic example. Mendel's incredibly careful, meticulous observation of those pea plant traits over generations. The color of the flowers, the shape of the seeds, wrinkled or smooth. That's how he identified the fundamental patterns of inheritance, the laws of genetics. He didn't have fancy DNA sequencers. It was all through painstaking observation and record keeping.
It really shows the power of just really looking carefully.
It does. It laid the groundwork for modern genetics, a powerful reminder of the impact of just really paying attention.
Okay, that really highlights the power of careful looking.
Now, what about the philosophical side of things? How does observation fit into our understanding of what's actually real? Does what we see equal reality?
That gets into epistemology, the study of knowledge and metaphysics, the study of reality itself. Our sources touch on this long-standing philosophical debate.
Between forms of realism, the idea that observation gives us, perhaps imperfectly, access to a reality that exists independently of our minds, and forms of constructivism, which argue that our understanding of reality is actively built or constructed by our perceptions, our concepts, our minds.
So are we seeing the world as it truly is, or are we constructing our own version of it in our heads? That old question.
Exactly. And related to that, our sources bring up this really important idea of theory-ladenness.
Theory-ladenness. Okay, what's that?
It basically means that our observations are never truly pure or theory-neutral. The theories, beliefs, concepts, and even values we already hold actually influence what we observe and how we interpret it.
So our expectations shape what we see.
In a way, yes. What scientists choose to study, what they count as relevant data, how they make sense of their findings, it's all inevitably shaped to some extent by the theoretical framework they're working within. It challenges the idea of pure objectivity.
So even in science, which strives for objectivity, there's always a degree of interpretation filtering the observation.
Yes, especially with complex phenomena or ambiguous data. What about in more abstract fields like logic and mathematics? Does observation even play a role there? It feels very different.
That's a good question. It seems purely mental.
Interestingly, our sources argue, yes, observation does play a role, particularly in the discovery phase. Recognizing patterns through careful observation is often the very first step.
Oh, so.
Think about mathematicians noticing regularities in numbers or geometric shapes or structures. That initial observation of a pattern can spark curiosity and lead to forming conjectures, new ideas, and eventually rigorous proofs.
So it's like seeing a pattern, maybe visually or conceptually, and then trying to figure out the underlying rule or structure.
Precisely. And our sources connect this to different ways of reasoning. Inductive reasoning, where we move from specific observations to broader generalizations, relies heavily on that initial act of observing patterns. And even in deductive reasoning, where we apply general theories or rules to specific cases, observation can still be important for testing whether our derived conclusions actually hold up in the real world or in the mathematical system we're exploring.
Okay, so observation isn't just for the physical world. It's even foundational, in a sense, for these abstract systems. Now, let's shift gears a bit and think about anthropology. How do anthropologists use observation to understand different cultures?
For anthropologists, observation is absolutely central, especially through what's called ethnography.
Right, that's like immersive field work.
Exactly. Ethnography is the systematic study of people and cultures, and it relies heavily on participant observation researchers immersing themselves in a community, living alongside people, and observing everyday life, social interactions, rituals, conversations, all to gain an in-depth, holistic understanding of that culture from the inside as much as possible.
It's like trying to understand how a complex social system works by watching all the parts interact in their natural setting.
That's a good way to put it. And our sources make an interesting point about the scales of observation in anthropology.
Scales? What does that mean?
It means that what you observe And the kinds of explanations you come up with can really depend on the level you're focusing on. Are you looking at micro-level interactions between individuals?
Okay.
Or meso-level dynamics within a community or organization? Or macro-level societal structures and historical processes?
I see, like zooming in or out.
Exactly. And what's significant or causal at one scale might not even be visible or relevant at another. The knowledge gained at different scales is often complementary, but you can't always just add it up neatly.
So the level at which you're observing really shapes your understanding and the kinds of questions you can even ask.
Absolutely. And observation is also the primary mechanism for how culture itself gets passed on.
Cultural transmission.
Yes. Our sources talk about cultural transmission, how beliefs, practices, norms, values, skills, and knowledge are shared across generations. That's vertical transmission, parent to child, and among peers, horizontal transmission, or from other adults, oblique transmission.
And this happens through
Imitation, explicit teaching, storytelling, participating in rituals, socialization practices, all of which rely fundamentally on observing what others do, say, value, and the results of their actions.
So, to kind of summarize this section, observation is truly fundamental for building knowledge, whether it's scientific, mathematical, or cultural, and it's how culture persists.
Exactly. But it's this duality, right? It's foundational, yet it's not a neutral, passive process. It's always shaped and sometimes distorted by our existing ideas, our cultural norms, the scale at which we're looking.
Right.
Our sources highlight this ongoing recursive relationship. We observe to build our understanding in conceptual frameworks, but those frameworks then influence what and how we observe in the future. This dynamic drives both scientific progress like paradigm shifts and cultural evolution, but it can also explain why certain biases or norms persist for so long.
Okay, so we know observation is complex and shaped by a lot. Let's really drill down now on that lens of observation, how our own individual perspectives, our biases, and also social dynamics influence what we see and how we interpret it.
We touched on theory-ladenness, but it sounds like it's worth diving deeper there.
It really is, because its influence is so pervasive. Theory-ladenness, or the influence of our prior beliefs and expectations, profoundly affects not just how we interpret what we see, but the meaning we assign to it, and even where we direct our attention in the first place.
It guides our focus.
Absolutely. And this isn't just for everyday life. It's true even in science, especially when dealing with ambiguous data or making difficult judgments. Our existing beliefs really do act like filters, sometimes helpful, sometimes not. And beyond our own internal filters, there are cognitive biases, right? Like confirmation bias.
Yes, that's a big one the sources discuss. Confirmation bias is our tendency to actively seek out, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses.
And we ignore or downplay stuff that contradicts what we think.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
We tend to underweight contradictory evidence. It can really reinforce our existing views and make it difficult to objectively assess new information or alternative perspectives.
Why do we do that?
Well, the sources suggest a few reasons. Maybe protecting our self-esteem, reducing cognitive dissonance, or sometimes it might even be a sort of misguided attempt to be efficient by sticking with what seems to work. While occasionally it might help us process information quickly, overall it's a major impediment to learning and objective evaluation.
Okay, so confirmation bias is a big one. What about how we explain people's behavior? Does observation play into that?
Definitely. This relates to attribution theory, how we infer the causes of behavior, both our own and others. And our observations are the raw data for these inferences, but our interpretations are often biased.
How so?
Our sources mention a few key concepts. Locus of control, that we attribute causes to internal factors, like someone's personality or effort, or external factors, like the situation or luck.
Right.
Then there's the actor-observer bias. We tend to attribute our own negative actions to external situational factors. I was late because of traffic. But others, negative actions to their internal disposition. They were late because they're irresponsible.
Ah, yes. I think we all do that sometimes.
And closely related is the fundamental attribution error, where we generally overestimate the role of dispositional or personality-based explanations for others' behavior while underestimating the impact of situational factors.
So we jump to conclusions about someone's character based on observing one action without fully considering the context.
Exactly. These attribution biases heavily influence how we interpret our social observations.
And then there are the more direct social influences. How do other people around us affect what we observe or report observing?
Yeah, this gets into the social construction of reality again, but also direct social pressure. Our sources discuss this extensively.
Like peer pressure.
Sort of, but sometimes more subtle.
Yeah.
The classic Ash experiments on conformity are a prime example.
Oh, let's about those again.
Solomon Ash had participants judge the length of lines. Really simple task. But they were in a group with Confederates, people secretly working for the experimenter, who deliberately gave the wrong answer.
Okay.
And a surprising number of the real participants actually went along with the obviously incorrect majority judgment, at least some of the time. They literally disregarded the evidence of their own senses.
Why? Just to fit in.
It seems to be two main reasons. Normative social influence, the desire to be liked and accepted, to not stand out. And informational social influence, genuinely believing the group must be right, especially if the task feels ambiguous, doubting your own judgment. So direct observation gets overridden by social cues.
Wow. That really shows the power of the group to shape even basic perception, or at least reported perception.
It does. And then there's the related bystander effect.
Right, where people are less likely to help someone in an emergency if lots of other people are present. How does observation fit in there?
It's key. Two main mechanisms are at play. Diffusion of responsibility, someone else will surely help, it's not solely up to me. And pluralistic ignorance.
Pluralistic ignorance.
That's where everyone privately disagrees with something, but assumes, incorrectly, that most other people accept it, because they observe everyone else acting as if they do. In an emergency, if no one else looks concerned or is rushing to help, you might observe their inaction and interpret the situation as less serious than it is, or assume inaction is the appropriate response.
So we observe others not acting, and that shapes our own observation of the situation's severity and our subsequent action or lack thereof.
Exactly. Our observation of others' lack of reaction becomes critical data.
It's a bit unsettling how much our social environment can impact even our basic interpretations and instincts. Now, our sources also briefly touched on something from physics, the observer effect in quantum mechanics. That's a different kind of influence, right? Not psychological or social.
Yes, very different, but conceptually relevant. In quantum mechanics, the very act of measuring or observing a quantum system inevitably disturbs it.
Like you can't measure an electron's position precisely without altering its momentum.
Exactly that kind of thing. It's a fundamental aspect of physical interaction at the quantum scale. It's not about cognitive bias or social pressure. It's about the measurement interacting with the measured. But it's a powerful reminder that observation isn't always, perhaps never is, a completely passive, detached process. Sometimes the act of looking changes the thing being looked at.
So there's this constant interplay, it seems, between our internal biases, the social context, maybe even the physical act of observing. It all shapes the final picture.
Absolutely. And the sources point out this trade-off. These biases and social influences aren't necessarily always bad. They can allow for faster processing, quicker decision-making, social cohesion, group coordination.
But the cost can be.
The cost can be accuracy, objectivity, resistance to new information, the perpetuation of stereotypes, or harmful group dynamics like bystander apathy. Observation is clearly shaped by more than just the simple pursuit of truth.
And it seems like observation is inherently social, doesn't it? Even when we're alone.
That's a really insightful point the sources make. Even when we observe something by ourselves, the cognitive tools we use, language, concepts, interpretive frameworks, are largely acquired socially. Our understanding is implicitly shaped by how we expect others might judge us or react, thinking back to attribution and conformity. Even our personal biases often reflect and reinforce dominant social beliefs.
So the idea of a purely individual, isolated observer is kind of an oversimplification.
It really is. Every observation is embedded in a social and cultural context. And often, the very scale at which we observe, as we discuss with anthropology, is itself determined by socially constructed frameworks of what's considered important or relevant.
Okay. This is all making me think about how much our own internal world and the social world around us shape what we even notice and how we make sense of it. It's incredibly complex. Now, let's bring artificial intelligence squarely into the picture. You mentioned earlier it's transforming things.
Absolutely. AI is rapidly changing our relationship with observation in really significant ways. It's giving us new tools to model observation, to augment our own senses, and to analyze observational data on a scale never before possible. It presents both huge opportunities and some serious challenges.
Okay, let's start with how AI is trying to model human observation. What does that actually involve?
Well, a major goal in AI research, especially in fields like computer vision and computational cognitive science, is to build models that can perceive and reason about the world in ways that mimic human abilities.
So teaching machines to see like us.
Essentially, yes. Computer vision models learn to identify objects, understand scenes, track motion, even generate realistic images. Our sources mention things like generative adversarial networks, GANs, or diffusion models that can create images, or neural radiance fields, NeurFs, that build 3D scenes from 2D pictures. They are trying to capture some aspects of how we process visual information.
And computational cognitive science.
There, researchers use AI techniques to build explicit, testable models of human cognitive processes like perception, attention, memory, learning, decision-making. They run simulations on these AI models and compare the results to human behavior in experiments.
So it's like using AI as a virtual laboratory to understand our own minds better.
Exactly. It helps refine theories about how we observe and make sense of the world.
That's fascinating. Now, how is AI actually helping us improve or augment our own observations? You mentioned this earlier.
Right. There are some really interesting developments here. Our sources discuss sensory substitution devices, or SSDs. These use technology, often involving AI for the processing, to translate information from one sensory modality that might be impaired into another modality.
Like the example of converting visual input into auditory signals for people who are blind.
Exactly. The AI processes the visual scene from a camera and converts it into structured sound patterns or maybe tactile patterns on the skin. And amazingly, through neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, individuals can actually learn to interpret these new sensory inputs and gain a functional sense of their surroundings.
That's incredible, essentially learning to see with sound or touch.
It really is. And then there are what the sources call intelligent sensory augmentation devices, or IS-8s.
How are they different?
They go beyond simple substitution. They use AI for more complex, often nonlinear processing of sensory signals. The idea is that this can potentially allow humans to perceive information or patterns that are entirely beyond our natural sensory capabilities.
Wow, that sounds almost like science fiction perceiving new dimensions or types of information.
It's definitely heading in that direction conceptually. Think about potentially perceiving magnetic fields or complex chemical signatures translated into a form our brain could learn to understand.
That's mind-blowing. What about in more traditional scientific observation? How is AI enhancing that?
AI is already having a huge impact there, mainly due to its ability to process and analyze massive amounts of data, far beyond human capacity.
Finding needles in haystacks.
Exactly. AI algorithms can sift through incredibly complex data sets from astronomy, genomics, particle physics, medical imaging, and identify subtle patterns, correlations, anomalies, or even potential errors that human observers might completely miss.
Any specific examples?
Our sources reference a study where AI was used to analyze a vast repository of mass spectrometry data from scientific publications. It was able to automatically identify a surprising number of inconsistencies and potential errors in published results, things that had slipped past peer review.
So AI can act as a kind of superpowered quality control check for science?
Potentially, yes. It highlights its power for enhancing rigor, spotting errors, and maybe even generating new hypotheses from complex observational data. It's becoming an indispensable tool for analysis in many fields.
So AI is becoming this incredibly powerful observer and analyzer for science. But you mentioned challenges. There's the potential for AI to reflect our own limitations, right? The bias issue.
That's the double-edged sword, yes.
Yeah.
It's a crucial point our sources emphasize. AI systems learn from the data they are trained on.
And that data comes from us.
Exactly. And if that human-generated data reflects existing societal biases, stereotypes, prejudices, or historical inequities, the AI system will learn those patterns as statistical regularity.
Without understanding fairness or context.
Precisely. It learned correlations, not causation or ethics. So we see examples like biased word embeddings where AI associates certain professions more with one gender, or facial recognition systems that perform less accurately on certain demographic groups, or predictive policing software that might concentrate resources in areas based on biased historical arrest data, potentially creating feedback loops.
And this biased AI output could then interact with our own human confirmation bias, couldn't it? We might trust the AI more readily if it confirms what we already suspect.
Absolutely. It can create a cycle where AI reflects human bias, and then humans use the biased AI output to confirm their own biases. It can amplify the problem.
So AI is both a mirror, reflecting our societal patterns, and potentially a magnifying glass, amplifying them due to its scale and speed.
That's a great way to put it. It forces a kind of critical introspection about our own observations and the data we generate.
On the flip side, could AI actually help us improve our own observation skills or mitigate our biases?
There's potential there too, yes. AI could theoretically be designed to provide more objective data analysis, flag instances where human reasoning seems biased, or offer alternative perspectives we might have overlooked.
Like a debiasing tool.
Potentially. Personalized educational tools using AI could help train people to become more aware of specific biases or improve their observational skills with targeted feedback. In areas like healthcare or environmental monitoring, AI can constantly observe states and provide alerts, contributing to well-being.
But there are ethical concerns there too, like privacy and surveillance.
Huge concerns. Constant monitoring, even for well-being, raises questions about data ownership, consent, and the potential for misuse. And it's important to clarify, as the sources do, that AI's role here is assistance. It can't guarantee happiness. Challenges and even negative feedback are crucial for growth. It's not about creating a perfectly smooth, challenge-free existence.
Right, so we're using AI to enhance observation, but there's this risk you mentioned earlier, the augmentation paradox. Could we become too dependent?
That's the paradox, exactly. While AI offers powerful augmentation, over-reliance could lead to a de-skilling effect, a decline in our own fundamental human observational skills, critical thinking abilities, and domain expertise.
We might stop practicing those skills if the AI does it for us.
Potentially. There's also the risk of placing uncritical trust in AI outputs, especially when the AI operates as a black box and we don't fully understand its reasoning process. How do we verify its observations or analyses if we can't follow its logic? So there's this real tension between leveraging the incredible power of AI for observation and analysis and preserving human agency, critical judgment, and fundamental skills. It's a balance we need to actively manage.
It's a really complex picture. AI offers so much potential for observation, but we need to be incredibly thoughtful and deliberate about how we develop and integrate it with our own human capabilities. Now, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, it's crystal clear that observation isn't just a neutral act of data gathering. It carries ethical weight.
You're absolutely right. Observation is not ethically neutral. It has responsibilities and implications, especially concerning moral judgment, privacy, and even our fundamental beliefs about the world.
How does observation connect to moral responsibility?
While holding someone morally responsible, praising or blaming them, usually requires that they had some control over their actions and understood the potential impact. Observation plays a key role here. We observe someone's behavior, the context, the outcomes, and from that, we infer things about their intentions, their knowledge, their capacities, all relevant to judging your responsibility.
So we observe actions to judge the actor.
In essence, yes. But our sources make an important distinction. Moral responsibility isn't the same as just causal responsibility. Observation might clearly show that someone's action caused harm, but judging them morally responsible requires considering factors like whether they knew what they were doing, if they intended the outcome, if they were aware of the risks. Observation provides the input, but the moral judgment involves interpretation of intent and awareness.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the ethics of AI observation? Surveillance comes to mind immediately.
Yes, that's a major concern. AI significantly amplifies the power and reach of surveillance technologies. This raises profound ethical questions about privacy erosion, the potential for mass surveillance without meaningful consent or accountability.
And the bias issue we discussed earlier comes back here too, doesn't it?
Critically, biased AI used in surveillance contexts like facial recognition that misidentifies people from certain groups more often, or predictive policing algorithms can lead to discriminatory outcomes and reinforce existing societal inequalities.
Predictive policing. How does that work and why is it potentially biased?
The idea is to use historical crime data to predict where crime is likely to occur and allocate police resources accordingly. But if the historical data itself reflects biased policing practices, like over-policing certain neighborhoods, the AI will learn those biases and might direct police back to those same areas, creating a feedback loop that justifies the initial bias, regardless of actual crime rates.
So the observation, data collection, is potentially biased, leading to biased AI predictions, leading to biased actions.
Exactly. And the black box nature of many complex AI systems makes it incredibly difficult to understand why they make certain predictions or decisions. This lack of transparency hinders efforts to detect bias, ensure fairness, and establish accountability when things go wrong.
So what's the path forward? How do we manage the ethics of AI observation?
The sources stress the urgent need for robust legal and ethical frameworks. This includes demanding transparency and explainability in AI systems, often called XAI, ensuring responsible data collection and use practices, implementing audits for fairness and bias, and establishing clear lines of accountability for developers and deployers of these technologies. Human oversight remains critical.
Okay, shifting slightly. How does observation interact with some of those bigger, almost existential questions, like free will versus determinism?
That's a classic philosophical debate. Observation plays into it on both sides. Observing consistent patterns in behavior and physical laws might seem to support determinism, the idea that everything is predetermined by prior causes.
If we can predict it, maybe it's not free.
That's one line of thought. But then there's our own subjective internal observation, our powerful feeling of making choices, of having agency. That strong experience of free will supports the opposing view. Philosophy offers various positions like compatibilism, arguing free will and determinism can coexist, and incompatibilism, arguing they can't. Observation provides data points but doesn't settle this deep philosophical question.
And our beliefs about free will or destiny, observation probably feeds into those too, maybe through confirmation bias.
Very likely. If you strongly believe in destiny, you might interpret observed events, especially coincidences, as evidence confirming it. If you believe strongly in free will, you focus on instances where choice seems paramount. Our observations get filtered through our existing belief systems.
What about observing something like cruelty? Is that a failure of observation?
That's a really interesting question. Our sources suggest cruelty isn't usually a failure of basic sensory observation. People often see the suffering they inflict or witness. The failure is more likely in the interpretation, the empathetic response, or the moral judgment.
So seeing isn't enough?
No. Factors like a lack of empathy, dehumanizing the victim, strong ideological biases, learned justifications for violence, or even the bystander effect we discussed, these can create a disconnect between observing suffering and feeling a moral imperative to act differently or intervene. The link between observation and moral action breaks down.
That observation-interpretation-action gap seems crucial in ethics.
Really is. And finally, what about the biggest questions? Life, death, meaning. Can observation, especially AI-powered observation, help us there? AI can certainly process vast amounts of data relevant to the scientific understanding of life, biology, neuroscience, etc. But questions about ultimate meaning, purpose, consciousness, or what happens after death, these tend to fall outside the realm of purely empirical observation. They are deeply philosophical, spiritual, and personal questions.
Right. Science observes the how, but maybe not the why in that sense.
Exactly. AI can analyze data about human behavior, including rituals surrounding death, for example. It can observe the patterns. But understanding the profound psychological, emotional, and social meaning of those rituals, which are rooted in cultural observation and transmission, but involve subjective experience and belief systems, that's currently beyond AI's capacity.
So it seems the ethical weight of observation really increases with the power to observe and act.
That's a key takeaway. While any individual human observation has ethical dimensions, technologically amplified observation, like large-scale AI surveillance or analysis, carries exponentially greater potential for impact, both good and bad. This places a much heavier ethical burden on the institutions and developers creating and using these tools.
And that observation-interpretation-action gap applies to AI too, doesn't it? And AI might observe patterns related to fairness or harm, but translating that observation into genuinely moral understanding and just action is a huge leap, maybe an impossible one for current AI.
That's precisely the challenge. Moving from correlation to causation, from pattern recognition to genuine understanding, and from observation to ethical judgment and action remains a profound hurdle for artificial intelligence.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this all up, what are the main things we should take away from this deep dive into human and AI observation?
I think the core message is that human observation is incredibly active, complex, and far from being a simple recording of reality. It's deeply intertwined with our biology, our cognition, our social interactions, our philosophical assumptions, and now increasingly with technology like AI.
It's our primary way of knowing the world, but it's also inherently subjective and shaped by so many factors.
Exactly. And we see this complex symbiosis emerging with AI. AI learns from our observations, including our biases, but it also offers these incredibly powerful new ways to observe, analyze, and potentially even augment our own senses. It's a relationship filled with immense opportunities, but also significant ethical challenges we absolutely have to grapple with.
Are there ways we can improve things? Strategies to mitigate the downsides for both humans and AI?
Yes, the sources suggest several avenues. For humans, it's about cultivating metacognition awareness of our own biases and thinking patterns. Promoting critical thinking skills, fostering empathy and perspective-taking, even specific training like bystander intervention can help bridge that observation-action gap.
And for AI.
The focus is on building more responsible AI. That means pushing for transparency and explainability, XAI, using diverse and representative data for training, actively auditing systems for fairness and bias, establishing strong ethical guidelines and regulations, potentially even using AI itself to help detect and mitigate bias, and always prioritizing meaningful human oversight and control.
Looking ahead, what do you see as the future trajectory?
We're likely to see increasingly sophisticated AI observation tools, more seamless integration with human perception, perhaps even brain-computer interfaces that blend observation in new ways. This raises fundamental questions about preserving human agency, ensuring ethical deployment, and understanding the long-term impacts on society and what it means to be human.
It really underscores that observation in all its forms is fundamental to this ongoing experiment of life.
Absolutely. And with that comes a profound responsibility to understand this evolving relationship between human and artificial observation, and to guide it with wisdom and foresight. Because how we observe and how our technology observes will significantly shape the future of knowledge, society, and the human condition itself.
That's a powerful thought to end on. So for you, the listener, maybe take a moment to consider, what are the lenses, the biases you might unknowingly hold that shape how you see the world? And how might those be reflected or even amplified in the AI systems you interact with every day? What small steps could you take, perhaps, to become a more critically aware observer of both the world around you and the information you consume? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
This is DigitView.